Hal Shurtleff with Camp Constitution Media here in Appomattox Court House, Virginia. And you're looking at the home where the surrender of Robert E. Lee took place on April 9th, 1865. And let me read the little plaque here. It says, at midday on April 9th, 1865, General Robert E. Lee rode into this yard, dismounted, and disappeared into the McLean House. Grant, surrounded by generals and staff officers, soon followed. Dozens of officers, horses, and onlookers waited outside. After 90 minutes, Lee and Grant emerged. To the silent salutes of Union officers, Lee rode back through the village to his defeated army. The home that hosted the surrender meeting was one of the best at Appomattox. Built in 1848, it had since 1862 been owned by businessman Wilmer McLean. The house became a sensation after the surrender. Union officers took some mementos, and in 1893 it was dismantled for display in Washington, D.C. But that display never happened, and the National Park Service reconstructed the building on its original site in the 1940s. And I understand that most of the house is original. There's obviously some repairs and things done to it. But we'll take a little walk inside. Well, here we are inside of the actual room where the surrender took place. We're here with Ranger Chris, who's going to give us a little historical narrative.
Certainly. Good afternoon. We're standing here in the parlor of the home of Wilmer McLean, and this was the room that Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee would meet in on April 9th of 1865 for about 90 minutes. And it's set up like the generals have just left. They did sit across from each other at two separate desks. Robert E. Lee here on the left, Ulysses S. Grant on the right. They don't even sign the same document. They actually swap letters. The terms of surrender and Lee's acceptance of them. Sign them, swap them, and once these generals leave the room about 3 o'clock that afternoon, there's a scramble for souvenirs that goes on in here by other Union generals who kind of stuck around wanting a trophy of this moment, like soldiers in any war. Most of that is paid for to Mr. McLean. It's not simply taken out. Mr. McLean is offered some money. An example is the desk that Ulysses S. Grant had used. General Philip Sheridan will come to Mr. McLean, offer him $20 in gold for that table. McLean says no, he doesn't wish to sell it, so Sheridan has two cavalrymen pick the table up, take it out, and he leaves the money. That's kind of how this is happening. Sheridan actually is going to give the table to George Armstrong Custer, probably right out front of the house here. It goes up to Michigan to Libby Custer's possession, and when Libby Custer died a widow in the 1930s, it was in her will it go to the Smithsonian. That's where most of the furniture is today.
Oh, really?
The original table that Grant used, both chairs, the bookcase, all of that is in the Smithsonian American History Museum in Washington. The Lee table ends up in the Chicago History Museum, and it's still there today. General Edward Ord supposedly bought that for $40 in cash. It's taken out and then ends up later on in Chicago. What comes back to this home that's original is from the McLean family's descendants. The two vases on the mantle, those are the original pieces. And so is the sofa on your right. It has been reupholstered. Other than that, it is the original sofa that was here at the time.
And McLean, wasn't he originally from Manassas, Virginia? Did he? What's the story? I hear the story that the war started in his kitchen and ended in his living room.
And that's a story he would love for you to know today. The reality of it's a little bit more complex. Basically, Wilmer McLean and his family are living not too far from the first battle of Bull Run, Manassas, July of 1861. They have a very large farm, a home twice the size of this. He married well, let's say that. They don't come here until 1863, 2 years later. And one reason they do is they're tired of all the fighting and moving of the armies in Northern Virginia. This seems like a much safer, quieter spot. And no one living in this area ever thought the war would come this far west. So it was a shock to everyone. McLean's moved down here, buy this house, and one of the reasons he chose to live here was his business. He needed access to the railroad, which is only about 3 miles away. Wilmer McLean is no longer a farmer. He has a brother who lives in Cuba, and they go into the sugar business together. So what Wilmer's basically doing is traveling around the South, getting that sugar in through the Union naval blockade, and selling it to the Confederate Army. He becomes basically a war profiteer in the latter 2 years of the Civil War. Makes almost $100,000 off that sugar. So he's a millionaire today. Problem is, it's all Confederate money. So as soon as the war ends, he's broke. There's nothing to show for it. He leaves that part of his story completely out, and he really talks up the irony of him coming down here to escape the war, and then it kind of following him is the beginning and the end, as you said. 1867, the McLeans pick up, move back home to Manassas, back home, lived here a total of 4 years.
Oh, so it's a really short duration.
Yes. Yes.
And when did this stop being a community? When did the park department take it
Well,
over?
this doesn't become a national park until basically 1935 is when Congress approves it. 1940 when there's actually a park really here. So landowners, few landowners are still here. Their property's purchased. By 1900, this village is basically a ghost town. The reason for that is the stagecoach road running through the center of town kind of gets superseded by the railroad. Railroad's 3 miles away. So by 1900, folks have picked up and moved to the railroad and the modern day town of Appomattox that exists there. When the courthouse building here burned in 1892, they decided to build a new one down there, the town of Appomattox, and this suffers as a result.
And the term Appomattox Court House is sort of archaic. It usually meant the county seat.
Exactly.
And there's still a few towns. I think there's Washington Courthouse in Ohio. There might be a few other towns like that.
There's quite a few still here in Virginia.
There is, yeah.
Spotsylvania Courthouse, another Civil War battle fought there. Up near Fredericksburg, Dinwiddie Courthouse down by Petersburg, and just south of here in Appomattox County, just south in Charlotte County, is a little town called Charlotte Courthouse.
Okay.
So there's quite a few, mostly in Virginia.
In Virginia. And how would people learn about visiting this place?
About visiting here, well, we have a park website, as all the national parks do.
Okay.
We have brochures available in most other, if you visit any other Civil War parks, they'll probably have information on us. Signs off the highway.
And you're open year-round?
We're open year-round.
Okay.
Exactly.
All right, well, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Excellent. And to continuing our walk around the Appomattox Courthouse National Park, we see this little place here, this little spot. Last shot from the artillery of the Army of Northern Virginia on the morning of April 9th, 1865. And there you see the two cannons and the house, which is the original house. And let me just read the little plaque here. Final combat. And it's a quote from a Private John Smith of the 100th 18th Pennsylvania. It seemed to me everyone was more scared than ever from the fact that we knew the war was nearly over and we did not want it to be killed at the end of the war. Late on the morning of April 9th, 1865, the Army of Northern Virginia engaged in its final combat before the flags of truce passed along the entire line, and as the Confederates withdrew through the village. The two sides exchanged scattered last shots. Some of the last cannons discharged were fired from the yard of the Pierce House to your left. The cannon in the Pierce yard caused some of the last casualties of the war in Virginia. The Confederate guns fired at Union infantry advancing toward you across the distant ridge. The identity of the last man killed in the fighting here is not known, but of all the men who died during the final battle, Appomattox Courthouse suffered a cruel and ironic fate. And just a short distance from where the last artillery of the Army of Northern Virginia was fired is the second place that Lee and Grant met. This would be the day after the surrender. On the knoll before you, Lee and Grant held the second of their two meetings at Appomattox Courthouse. They met here on the morning of April 10. Grant hoped to enlist Lee's support in urging the surrender of other Confederate armies, and Lee was intent on working out the final details of surrender. Lee refused Grant's request to exert his influence with other armies, but the two officers did resolve details of the surrender. Grant agreed to provide the Confederates with individual parole passes to safeguard their journey home. He would also allow surrendered soldiers to pass free on all government transportation on their way home. During their two meetings at Appomattox, not a harsh word passed between Lee and Grant. Wrote one Confederate, "General Grant and his men treated us nobly, more nobly than was ever a conquered army treated before or since. The process of reconciliation has already begun." And here is the spot where many of the Confederates actually surrendered. And Union Brigadier General Joshua Chamberlain, who was from Maine, He was governor of Maine after the war, and he is depicted in the movie Gods and Generals. On April 12, 1865, Union Brigadier General Joshua Chamberlain watched the distant ridge as the Confederates prepared for the surrender. They formed into column, marched into the valley, then up the Richmond-Lynchburg Stage Road toward the village. As the column approached this knoll, Chamberlain ordered his men to honor them. The Federals snapped to carry arms, the marching salute. A surprised Major General John Gordon instantly ordered his men to return the salute. Until now, the drama of Appomattox had been played out by major figures, but here was a profound expression of respect by the Army's common soldiers. They, more than anyone else, would blaze the path to reconciliation in the years that followed.